We're bringing in another guest. Carlos Singh is joining us by phone. He is a former federal prosecutor. He is a lecturer at San Jose State University. Carlos, welcome. Thank you for doing this. There you are. As a former federal prosecutor, I kind of want to jump right in with you. What does the Special Counsel Jack Smith need to do, Carlos?
Well, in this particular case, as I think your prior guest alluded to, he's charged with 3 conspiracies: one to defraud the U.S., one to obstruct an official proceeding, that is preventing Congress or seeking to prevent Congress from doing its constitutional duties on January 6th of a couple of years ago, and then seeking to prevent citizens from voting or having their votes legitimately counted. And this all happened largely in 7 states. What Jack Smith has to do, sort of 3 quick points on there, and I'll focus, I'll kind of bring in the charges. He has to obviously show a conspiracy. That means an agreement between Mr. Trump, the defendant, and others. And in this case, Jack Smith has charged 7 others, or indicated 6 others, 5 lawyers and a political consultant, including one underling lawyer from the Department of Justice who tried to create a sham investigation to say that there was legitimacy in the claims that they were advancing. The second point is defraud. And defrauding is, in essence, false statement, lies, dishonesty, deceit, seeking to cheat to get something of value. And here, what the value was, it doesn't have to be money. It's seeking to get the presidency, to remain in office. And so, and then the third element or point that Jack Smith has to worry about in making sure is intent, because in every criminal case, the prosecution has to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. And in this instance, the indictment reflects a consciousness of guilt on the part of the former president, in that it lists a number of, for example, White House administration officials, his senior staff, White House lawyers, state and federal officials who had told Mr. Trump that he had lost the election, that there was nothing there in terms of seeking. And nonetheless, the indictment alleges that he continued to advance these statements of fraud, statements of deceit, in order to remain in office. And in some, you can say that the purpose of the conspiracy, according to what Jack Smith has to do, was to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election and for him to retain power.
Carlos, I've been hearing various legal experts, I don't know of their political affiliations, but describing this case, some of them as rock solid, done deal, no path out of this. What is your reading of the case based on what you know?
Well, the special counsel has a very strong case. And as a matter of fact, I've heard defense lawyers indicate that Mr. Trump is toast in this instance. And so Mr. Trump does have defenses. For example, he can claim that all this is First Amendment. He has a right to free speech. But the judge will point out, and the prosecution will point out, that free speech is limited. So, for example, defamation is a limit on free speech. You can't do that. You can't, as going back to the early 1900s, in terms of the Espionage Acts and certain Supreme Court cases, you can't yell fire in a theater because it causes a stampede. And in this particular instance, he could argue that conspiracy, all these false statements were really free speech statements. But the thing about conspiracy is there is a limit there, because conspiracy are words or acts that two or more people get involved to commit a crime. And so there are going to be limits. So my sense as I read this is that the special counsel does have a very strong case against the president in this instance, the former president, I should say, in this instance.
Carlos, I'm interrupting briefly just to say, Michael's telling me that they're waiting for the judge, kind of raising the question, all right, she knew this was happening, where is the judge? So apparently nothing has actually taken place yet. Carlos, you talked about free speech. Another big chunk of what the defense is apparently going to talk about is the claim that Donald Trump truly believed that the election had been stolen from him? Where, if anywhere, does that take him?
Well, he could claim that. And he very well, in fact, I think one of his lawyers has already publicly said that this is all about free speech. But I would remind him and others who believe that, as I've indicated, there are limits to free speech. And Jack Smith goes through listing over half a dozen individuals and instances where the president, the former president, was reminded of the fact that he had lost and there was nothing to the claims of fraud and so forth. And then I'll also indicate, as pointed out by in the indictment, and it looks like it was a statement allegedly made by Rudy Giuliani, where he says, after going through this process of the various states where they were alleging, I think 7 states, they were alleging that there was fraud there, that votes were improperly counted or double counted and so forth, that Rudy Giuliani allegedly said that they have many theories as to why this happened, but they have no evidence. And that seems to indicate sort of a sense of corroborating aspect because of the dozens of cases that Mr. Trump sought in state and federal courts. He lost them all. In fact, he lost them on motions to dismiss for lack of evidence. So I think that he's got a steep hill to climb in order to prevail.
So there's been talk, and former Attorney General Bill Barr, part of the talk, saying, hey, Jack Smith has got a lot more. This is only the tip of the iceberg. What cards might they not be showing? What might that look like?
Well, for example, the chief of staff, the former president, I think Mr. Meadows, there's several individuals that have testified in the grand jury. And it doesn't appear that statements made from a number of individuals in the grand jury are reflected in the indictment. And so being chief of staff, one would normally think or reasonably think that he was close to the president, the former president, had conversations, and he's probably going to bring that out and have that. And there are a variety of other individuals like this. But at the same time, I would also say that 80 to 90% of this indictment, the information, the allegations contained in this indictment, are largely known through the congressional January 6th congressional hearings. And so in terms of trying to get a speedy trial, I think Jack Smith can point to that. But I do believe that there are a number of individuals, likely you can kind of glean, likely at least maybe a dozen or so, that would reflect that are not listed here, but would provide more evidence of intent and conversations they had with the president, including the indictment alleges conversations with the former vice president, Mr. Pence, that would indicate that there's more behind this indictment that hasn't been disclosed.
We'll find out. Well, you've heard the speculation. I mean, people are jumping way ahead if the former president is convicted, if he is elected. But one of the questions that keeps popping up, could he pardon himself? What's your opinion on that, Carlos?
That's a constitutional dicey issue because the Constitution doesn't really say he could pardon himself from the federal indictments and cases, the one that he's going to be arraigned on in Washington, D.C., I guess in a few minutes or within the hour, and the one in Florida. Technically, he could pardon himself. He could also instruct the Department of Justice to drop the cases. Obviously, there could be a lot of uproar and repercussions because of that. But I will note one thing, even if he does pardon himself, or somebody pardons him, somebody else wins the presidency, and they pardon him, that's still because of our constitutional federalist form of government, state and federal, that pardon does not extend to the 2 potential state cases, the one in New York that was charged by Mr. Bragg about 6 months ago, and the one that appears to be pending in the next month in Atlanta. So those cases would still go forward, even if Mr. Trump were to be the nominee and win the election, a pardon would not affect those cases. Those cases would still go forward, and he could still face criminal jeopardy in those instances. And so there are a variety of issues. For example, other issues that pop up. For example, what if he's convicted? Does he get bail pending appeal? And part of the reason I say that is because it appears that the track record in Washington, D.C., despite as fast as it tries to proceed, normally cases take about a year to resolve from indictment to trial and sentencing. So right now we're about a year away, a little more than a year away from the national elections. And certainly by then we're going to know who the Republican nominee is, as well as the Democrat nominee is. And so it creates a number of political issues separate and apart from the legal, but they impact each other.
Carlos Singh, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Carlos Singh, teacher, lecturer, former federal prosecutor, really appreciated your time. Thank you so much.